December 2nd, 1993, Medellin, Colombia. A man is running across a rooftop, barefoot, shirtless, out of breath. This man has $30 billion to his name. He controls 80% of the world's cocaine supply. He has assassinated presidential candidates, bombed passenger planes, and declared war on an entire nation, and won. Presidents have feared him. Generals have answered to him. The CIA has quietly worked around him, and right now, he has one bodyguard left. One. He made one mistake. He called his son. The call lasted 90 seconds. That was enough. 3 bullets ended. One behind the ear, then silence. But here's what no one ever told you. What Netflix buried. What Washington hoped you'd never ask about. What his own son spent his life trying to expose. The man on that rooftop? He didn't just build a cartel. He exposed a world where the CIA looked the other way, where governments negotiated with terrorists, where the men hunting him were shaking hands with death squads, and where the most dangerous secrets weren't in Medellin, they were in Washington, D.C., and the story that Netflix told you, the one with the stirring narration, and the archival footage and the thrilling gunfights. That story captured some of it. Some of the spectacle, some of the drama, some of the blood. But not all of the truth, not the part about Washington. Not the part about the CIA, not the part about the men in suits in air-conditioned offices, who played both sides of the war on drugs, and have never once had to answer for it. Not the part about the son who changed his name and spent his life trying to make peace with a father who made war his religion. Not the part about what actually happened on that rooftop, the mystery that remains, 32 years later, officially unresolved. Tonight, we go all the way back to the beginning they never showed you, to the truth behind the truth. This is the story Netflix hid. Before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from tonight? What time is it where you are? Drop your city and time in the comments. I read every single one. Let's see how far around the world this story reaches. Hit subscribe right now, because once you hear one of these, you'll want all of them. Drop a like if you're already in. It matters more than you know. And now, turn off the lights. Get comfortable. We are going to spend the next few hours together. December 1st, 1949, Rio Negro, Antioquia, Colombia. A boy is born in a small town 45 minutes outside of Medellin. His parents give him a long name. The kind of name that sounds important, even before you do anything to deserve it. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, his father, Abel de Jesus Escobar Exaviri, is a humble cattle farmer, a hard-working man, a man with dirt on his boots and dignity in his bearing. His mother, Hermilda de los Dolores Gaviria Barrio, is a school teacher, a woman who believes in education, in proper behavior, in the idea that knowledge is the way out of poverty. They are not wealthy, they are not poor in the grinding, desperate sense that breaks people completely. But they live in a world where money makes the difference between comfort and struggle, between dignity and indignity, and they have never had quite enough of it. The family moves to Envigado, a township on the outskirts of Medellin. When Pablo is young, Envigado is not a slum. But it is not prosperity either. It is that in-between place that Colombia has always produced in abundance, close enough to the city to see how the wealthy live, far enough away to understand you are not one of them. Pablo grows up watching this. He watches the men with cars and good clothes and ease in their movements. He watches the way money changes, the way people hold themselves, the way it smooths the rough edges of existence, the way it opens doors that stay locked for everyone else. He does not just notice this, the way children notice things and forget. He files it away. He thinks about it. He decides, somewhere in his childhood, that whatever it takes, whatever it costs, he is going to be one of those men. This is not the story of a man who became a monster because the world gave him no choice. That narrative is too convenient, too clean. Pablo Escobar was given choices. He made them deliberately, with clear eyes and a calculating mind, but understanding where those choices came from. Understanding the soil that grew them matters. If you want to understand the full truth, Colombia in the 1950s and 1960s is a country still bleeding from a decade of civil conflict known as La Violencia, the violence, a period from 1948 to 1958, during which over 200,000 Colombians were killed in political warfare between liberal and conservative factions. The country that Pablo Escobar is born into is a country that has normalized blood, that has learned to live with death as a background note to everyday life. Institutions are fragile. The police are feared more than trusted by the poor. The government is a distant abstraction that passes laws but does not send roads or schools or hospitals to the neighborhoods where the Escobars live. Into this world, a boy with enormous ambition and no patience for the slow, legitimate path begins his career. He starts the way all self-made criminals start. Small, petty things, a kind of crimes that barely register. He steals tombstones from cemeteries. This detail, which sounds almost comedic in the retelling, is actually deeply revealing. He doesn't steal them out of desperation or impulse. He sandblasts the names and inscriptions off them, erasing the dead from their own monuments, and resells them as new. This is not random vandalism. This is a business. He is 12 or 13 years old, and he is already thinking in terms of supply, of raw material, of markup. He sells fake diplomas. He forges report cards. He steals cars. By the time he is in his mid-teens, Pablo Escobar has already understood something that takes most criminals a lifetime to learn, that the law is not a moral boundary. It is an obstacle course, and the people who succeed are the ones who learn to navigate it, rather than confront it head-on. His first arrest comes in 1974. He is 24 years old, a car theft. Not the most impressive of charges, but he walks out of police custody quickly, and the experience does nothing to deter him. If anything, it clarifies his thinking. He is already operating in the world of contraband, cigarettes, alcohol, stereo equipment, household goods smuggled across borders and sold at a markup. He understands logistics. He understands the value of paying the right people to look the other way. He understands that in Colombia, in the early 1970s, the official economy and the shadow economy are not separate worlds. They are deeply, intimately intertwined. And then, somewhere in the middle of the 1970s, Pablo Escobar looks at the world around him and sees the same thing that a handful of other Colombian criminals are beginning to see: the greatest business opportunity in the history of organized crime. Cocaine. To understand Pablo Escobar, you have to understand the world he entered. You have to understand the cocaine boom of the 1970s, what it was, where it came from, and why a young man from the outskirts of Medellin was perfectly positioned to ride it to unfathomable wealth. Cocaine is not new. The coca plant has been cultivated in the Andes for thousands of years. Indigenous peoples of South America chewed coca leaves for stamina, for altitude sickness, for spiritual purposes. In the late 19th century, European chemists refined cocaine hydrochloride from coca leaf, and for a brief, extraordinary period, it was sold legally in medicines, in tonics, in a certain soft drink that still carries its legacy in its name. Sigmund Freud wrote enthusiastically about its properties. The pharmaceutical company Merck sold it in catalogs. By the early 20th century, the damage became undeniable, and cocaine was criminalized in most of the Western world. For decades, it remained a fringe drug, expensive, difficult to obtain, associated with a thin sliver of bohemian urban culture. Then the 1970s happened. Cocaine exploded across North America and Europe with the velocity of a cultural earthquake. The reasons are complex. The post-Vietnam era created a generation looking for escape. The disco era turned cocaine into a status symbol, a party drug for the successful and the beautiful. Hollywood, Wall Street. The music industry. Cocaine moved through the glamour economy like wildfire. Demand soared, prices were extraordinary. A gram of cocaine in New York in the late 1970s could sell for well over $100. The margins on cocaine made every other criminal enterprise look like a hobby. And the world's natural supply of coca leaf happened to grow primarily in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, the Andean nations sitting right next to Colombia. Colombia was perfectly positioned. It had the geography, jungle, mountains, remote airstrips. It had the infrastructure of contraband networks already in place from decades of smuggling. It had a tradition of men who knew how to move goods across borders and bribe officials and outrun police. What it needed was someone with the vision to scale up, to turn cocaine from a cottage industry into an industrial operation. Pablo Escobar was not the first person to move cocaine in Colombia. He was not even among the first few. But he was the one who understood, with absolute clarity, how to make it into something the world had never seen before. The pivotal moment comes in 1975. A drug trafficker named Fabio Restrepo, a mid-level cocaine distributor operating out of Medellin, is found dead. The circumstances are attributed, in the understanding of everyone in that world, to Pablo Escobar. It has never been legally proven that Escobar ordered Restrepo's killing. But in the shadow economy of early Medellin cocaine trading, proof is not the currency of understanding. Everyone understood. Pablo Escobar was 25 years old. He killed the man above him and took his operation. Immediately, he didn't hesitate. He didn't negotiate. He moved in, took control of Restrepo's routes and contacts and product, and began expanding. The Ochoa brothers, Jorge Luis, Juan David, and Fabio Ochoa Vasquez, were a wealthy Medellin family already operating in the cocaine trade. They had resources, connections, and a more refined, business-like approach to trafficking. They recognized in Escobar something that was either a gift or a monster, depending on your perspective. An absolute willingness to do whatever was necessary. He would kill anyone who stood in his way. Not as punishment, not as revenge, as strategy. By the late 1970s, Escobar and the Ochoa brothers, along with other traffickers including the violent and charismatic Carlos Leder and the hulking, brutal Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano, had formed what would become known to the world as the Medellin cartel. The cartel was not, technically, a single hierarchical organization with a president and a board of directors. It was more fluid than that, a network of semi-autonomous trafficking operations that cooperated on logistics, protection, and enforcement, while each maintaining their own control over their respective operations. But Pablo Escobar was, from very early on, the first among supposed equals. He was the one with the vision. He was the one who understood that the way to transform cocaine trafficking from a profitable criminal business into a global economic empire was to control every step of the supply chain. He began purchasing coca paste directly from producers in Bolivia and Peru. Massive, multi-ton shipments. He built cocaine processing laboratories in the Colombian jungle, remote facilities deep in the Amazon basin, where the raw paste was refined into cocaine hydrochloride. He developed transportation networks, initially using small planes and Caribbean routes to move product into the United States. He established distribution networks in Miami, New York, and eventually cities across the entire United States. By the age of 26, Pablo Escobar was already depositing sums of over $3 million into banks and owned a fleet of more than 15 airplanes, 6 helicopters, and a personal Learjet. The scale of what he built in the late 1970s and early 1980s is almost impossible to comprehend with modern minds, because we have lived in a world that has tried for 40 years to understand the war on drugs, and we still underestimate how staggering the numbers were. By the early 1980s, the Medellin cartel was sending an estimated 15 tons of cocaine per day into the United States. Per day, at 1980s street prices, the revenue generated by 15 tons of cocaine in a single day is a number that defies easy visualization. The cartel was earning an estimated $420 million per week, every week, 52 weeks a year. Pablo Escobar's personal net worth climbed to an estimated $30 billion, landing him on Forbes magazine's list of the world's wealthiest individuals. An extraordinary, surreal fact that was simply published in the magazine, alongside shipping magnates and oil barons, as though it were perfectly normal. To manage this much cash was itself a logistical problem. The Medellin cartel was reportedly spending $2,500 a month on rubber bands alone, just to bundle the physical bills. They were burying money in fields, packing it into warehouse walls, losing track of tens of millions of dollars in stashes that were never recovered. Pablo Escobar himself once acknowledged that he wrote off approximately 10% of his annual income, roughly $3 billion, to losses caused by rats, eating the cash in storage and moisture rot destroying bills he didn't have time to count. In one desperate night during his years on the run, when his daughter Manuela was shivering from cold in a safe house, he reportedly burned $2 million in cash to keep her warm. These are the numbers behind the story, the numbers Netflix showed you as background detail, the numbers that make the cartel feel mythological rather than real. But Escobar was not just building an empire of money. He was building a system of power that reached into every corner of Colombian society, political, judicial, military, and cultural. And to understand how he did that, you have to understand the two instruments he used with equal facility. Plata o plomo, silver or lead, bribe or bullet. This was not a slogan. This was a governance philosophy. It was how Pablo Escobar managed an entire nation. You receive the offer, the silver, the money, the arrangement, the comfortable accommodation with reality, and you either accept it or you receive the alternative. There was no third option. There was no negotiation after the initial offer. There was no appeal. Thousands of Colombian police officers, judges, government officials, journalists, and politicians received this offer. The overwhelming majority took the silver. This was not weakness. This was rationality. The sums being offered were transformative, enough to set a family up for generations, enough to buy a house and send children to good schools and never worry about money again. And the alternative was death, not just death for you, but potentially death for your family. Pablo Escobar was not squeamish about what he did to the families of people who refused him. Colombia in the 1980s was not a functioning state so much as a state that had been systematically hollowed out by narco money and narco violence, until what remained was a shell that looked like a government, but had been fundamentally compromised at every level. This is one of the things Netflix never fully showed you. The show depicted Plata o Plomo as a dramatic moment, a scene where a man is offered a briefcase and a threat and makes a choice. The reality was more banal and more pervasive. It was offers made over lunch. It was envelopes left on desks. It was phone calls from people who never identified themselves. It was the slow, systematic corruption of an entire society. Not a single dramatic moment, but thousands of small accommodations. day after day, year after year, until the institutions meant to contain Pablo Escobar were, in significant part, in his pocket by 1981. Pablo Escobar is 31 years old and richer than God. He builds Hacienda Naples, named after Naples, Italy, because why not, when you have $30 billion and no one to tell you no? The estate sits between Bogota and Medellin in the Magdalena Medio Valley. It covers approximately 3,000 acres, though some estimates place it closer to 7,000. Escobar reportedly spent $63 million building and stocking it. The entrance gate of Hacienda Naples is adorned with the small white Piper PA-18 plane that Escobar used on his first cocaine run to the United States. Mounted like a trophy, a declaration, he is not hiding what he is. He is celebrating it. Inside the estate, he builds a private airport, a helipad, a bullfighting arena, a soccer field, artificial lakes, several swimming pools, a sculpture garden featuring life-size concrete dinosaurs, because he has a strange affinity for them, and most memorably, a private zoo. The zoo is not a small collection. Escobar fills it with giraffes, elephants, ostriches, exotic birds, rhinoceroses, and 4 hippopotamuses imported from Africa. The hippos in particular will outlast everything else about Pablo Escobar's story in a way that is both bizarre and darkly poetic. When the estate was eventually seized by the Colombian government after his death, the large animals were transferred to other zoos. But the hippos, which had already begun breeding in the estate's lagoons and surrounding waterways, proved impossible to relocate. Today, more than 3 decades after Escobar's death, the Colombian river system is home to an estimated 150 hippopotamuses, an invasive species, thriving and expanding, the accidental ecological legacy of a dead drug lord. The cocaine hippos, as they are popularly known, are now a significant concern for Colombia's biodiversity, and they are likely there to stay. This detail, the hippos, feels emblematic of Pablo Escobar's entire legacy. He built something so disproportionate, so extreme, so far beyond any normal human scale, that even after his death, after the gunfight and the rooftop and the photographs and the headlines, pieces of what he created continue to live and grow and spread in ways that no one can fully control. But back to 1981, back to the man at the height of his power, hosting parties at Hacienda Naples for politicians and celebrities and cartel associates. Back to the man throwing enormous amounts of money at the poor neighborhoods of Medellin. This is the Robin Hood dimension of Pablo Escobar, the one that Netflix acknowledged but never fully interrogated. Because it is genuinely uncomfortable, Escobar built housing projects for Medellin's poor. He constructed schools. He funded hospitals. He built and lit soccer fields in the barrios. Because in Colombia, soccer is not a sport. It is religion, community, identity. He sponsored local teams and gave poor children in the slums something to do with their evenings that didn't involve petty crime. He called his charitable operation Medellin Without Slums, and he genuinely changed the physical landscape of the poorest parts of the city. He was cheered when he walked through certain neighborhoods, the way a head of state is cheered. People named their children after him. When he was later on the run, hiding in slum houses throughout Medellin, the poor of that city protected him, not just from fear, but from genuine loyalty, because he had done things for them that the government had never bothered to do. Understanding this requires sitting with a deeply uncomfortable truth. A man can simultaneously build schools and order the massacre of civilians. A man can be the most lethal criminal in his country's history and be genuinely loved by hundreds of thousands of people. The moral simplicity that makes good television. The clear villain. The clear hero does not survive contact with the actual story. The Colombian government in the 1970s and 1980s had largely abandoned the urban poor, Social services were minimal, infrastructure was inadequate, and the institutions that were supposed to protect citizens were either absent or corrupt. Pablo Escobar stepped into that vacuum with money and with visibility. He showed up. He handed out cash at community events. He was photographed with children in his arms and soccer balls at his feet. He was called El Padrino, the Godfather, and the comparison was not ironic. People meant it with warmth. Netflix showed you glimpses of this. What Netflix did not show you was the full depth of the political calculation behind it. Because Pablo Escobar's generosity was not purely altruism, it was infrastructure. Every family he helped was a family that would warn him when the police came, a family that would hide him, a family that would lie to authorities when asked about his whereabouts. His charity was, among other things, the construction of a human shield. But even understanding the calculation does not erase the reality of what was built. Schools that educated children, houses that protected families from weather and violence, soccer fields that gave communities a center. The cynicism and the genuine benefit coexisted. Both were real. In 1982, Pablo Escobar decides to take the most audacious step of his career to that point. He runs for Congress. The Colombian Constitution of the time allowed for alternate members of Congress, substitutes who would take a representative seat in their absence. Pablo Escobar runs as the alternate for Jairo Ortega Ramirez, a member of the Liberal Party representing the Medellin region. He wins. In November 1982, Pablo Escobar Gaviria, drug lord, murderer, architect of the world's largest cocaine empire, takes a seat in the Colombian Congress. He attends sessions. He is photographed in the legislative chambers. He proposes laws. He makes speeches about poverty and about the need for Colombia to care for its least fortunate citizens. He is, by some accounts, an effective legislator during the brief period of his service. This is not, to be clear, a coincidence or a vanity project. Escobar wanted something very specific from politics. He wanted diplomatic immunity, the legal protection that came with holding office, which would shield him from prosecution and, most critically, from extradition to the United States. He also wanted respectability. He wanted the transformation from narco to statesman that would have made him, in his own estimation, untouchable. It almost worked. His nemesis in this project was Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, the Minister of Justice appointed by Colombia's new president, Belisario Betancur. In 1983, Lara Bonilla was a young, idealistic politician who was neither impressed by Escobar's money nor intimidated by his reputation. He launched a public campaign to expose what everyone in Colombian politics privately understood but had agreed to politely ignore, that Pablo Escobar was a cocaine trafficker. Lara Bonilla held up documents in Congress. He named Escobar explicitly. He presented evidence of the origins of his wealth. He made the case, loudly and publicly, that a drug kingpin was sitting in the Colombian legislature. The response from most of Colombian politics was silence. Some of Escobar's allies tried to fight back. There were accusations and counter-accusations, but Lara Bonilla held firm. Escobar, facing exposure and the collapse of his political ambitions, resigned from Congress in January 1984. 3 months later, on April 30th, 1984, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was shot dead on a Bogota highway. He was traveling in a motorcade when 2 gunmen on motorcycles pulled alongside his car and opened fire. He died in the attack. He was 36 years old. The assassination of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was not just a murder. It was a declaration of war. It was Pablo Escobar announcing, in the clearest possible terms, that Colombia's institutions would pay a blood price for attempting to hold him accountable. It was the moment that transformed Escobar from a criminal who could be managed into a criminal who could not be contained. The Colombian government declared a state of siege. President Betancur, faced with the assassination of his own minister by a drug cartel, finally signed the extradition order, the legal mechanism that had been on the books since a 1979 treaty with the United States, but had largely sat unused. The first extradition of a Colombian drug trafficker to the United States was carried out in 1984. For Pablo Escobar, extradition was not just a legal threat, it was existential. Colombia's prisons, as we will see, were places where he could operate with relative freedom, buying guards and judges and maintaining his empire. American prisons were something else entirely. American prosecutors were something else entirely. American federal courts operated outside the reach of his billions. An extradited Escobar was a dead cartel. He organized. He created a front organization called Los Extraditables, the Extraditables, ostensibly a shadowy group of criminals threatened by the extradition treaty. But in reality, as one of the Ochoa brothers later explained in a 2000 interview with PBS Frontline, essentially a nickname Escobar gave himself. Los Extraditables distributed literature, sent threatening letters, campaigned publicly against extradition, and used violence to make their point. Their letters and communiques closed with a line that became infamous in Colombia. "We prefer a grave in Colombia to a prison in the United States." And then the violence began. Not the contained, targeted violence of cartel-on-cartel warfare that Colombia had grown accustomed to. Something different, something that fit no existing category. Narcoterrorism. Netflix gave you the bombings. It gave you the explosions and the wreckage and the grief on Colombian faces in archival footage. What it did not give you was the scale, the actual documented, verified scale of what Pablo Escobar unleashed on Colombia in the years between 1984 and his surrender in 1991. From 1984 to 1991, Escobar was directly responsible for the assassinations of an attorney general, 3 presidential candidates, 51 judges on the Supreme Court, 298 police officers killed in a single year alone during one particularly intense campaign in Medellin, scores of journalists and ordinary civilians who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place when his bombs went off. The numbers are not metaphorical. They are documented. They are names in police files and graves in cemeteries and children who grew up without parents because a man with $30 billion and an absolute refusal to be extradited decided that Colombia itself was his enemy. Let us walk through the most significant of these acts, one by one, because understanding them individually, not as a montage, not as a series of dramatic television moments, but as real events with real victims, is the only way to truly understand what Pablo Escobar was. On November 6th and 7th, 1985, the M19 guerrilla group stormed the Palace of Justice in Bogotá, taking hostages and engaging Colombian military forces in a 2-day siege. The Palace of Justice was Colombia's Supreme Court. When it was all over, 98 people were dead, including 11 of Colombia's 24 Supreme Court justices. The M19's connection to Pablo Escobar has been debated and investigated for decades. The widely understood belief, supported by significant evidence, though never conclusively proven to a legal standard, is that Escobar provided financial backing for the operation. The timing was not coincidental. The Supreme Court was in the process of reviewing the constitutionality of the extradition treaty. The siege and its aftermath resulted in the destruction of extradition files and the deaths of several justices who had been inclined to uphold the treaty. Within a year of the siege, the Colombian Supreme Court ruled extradition unconstitutional. Whether Escobar directly ordered the Palace of Justice siege or merely funded a group that carried out an operation he knew would benefit him remains an open question in Colombian historical and legal scholarship. What is not an open question is that the result, the destruction of extradition files and the deaths of judges who might have voted against him, served his interests with extraordinary precision. In August 1989, Colombia prepares for presidential elections. The leading candidate is Luis Carlos Galán, a charismatic, progressive politician of the Liberal Party who had been instrumental in pushing Escobar out of politics in 1983. It was Galán who had publicly refused to allow Escobar to associate with his new liberalism movement. Galán was now the frontrunner for the presidency, and he was loudly and explicitly in favor of extradition. On August 18, 1989, Luis Carlos Galán is addressing a political rally in Socha, a municipality near Bogotá, standing before thousands of supporters. When gunmen open fire, he is shot multiple times. He dies within hours. Galán was 45 years old. He had a wife and 3 sons. He was, on most accounts, one of the most principled and genuinely capable politicians Colombia had produced in a generation. His assassination caused a national convulsion. The grief was genuine and widespread. But Pablo Escobar was not interested in grief. He was interested in results. And the result was that the Colombian government, under new President Cesar Gaviria, who had been Galán's campaign manager and who ran for president himself after Galán's death, explicitly in tribute to his fallen colleague, declared war on the Medellin cartel. 3 months after Galán's murder, on November 27, 1989, Avianca Flight 203 takes off from Bogotá's El Dorado International Airport, bound for Cali. On board are 107 passengers and crew. In the cargo hold, hidden in the seat pocket of a passenger, is a bomb constructed by Escobar's explosives experts. The intended target, Cesar Gaviria, did not board the plane. He missed the flight. Intelligence later suggested Escobar believed Gaviria would be on board. The bomb detonates at approximately 30,000 feet. The plane comes apart in the air. All 107 people on board are killed. Among the dead are 2 agents from the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, an act that shifts the entire equation of American involvement in the hunt for Escobar. 9 days later, on December 6, 1989, a truck bomb is detonated outside the DAS, the Administrative Department of Security, Colombia's National Intelligence Agency, in Bogotá. The explosion is enormous. 63 people are killed. More than 600 are wounded. A building adjacent to the DAS headquarters, primarily occupied by civilians, is partially destroyed. This was not a targeted assassination. It was mass murder as political messaging in Medellin itself. Beginning in 1989 and escalating through 1991, Escobar launched a direct campaign against the city's police force. He offered a bounty. The specific amount varied over time and across different accounts, but figures cited range from $1,000 to $4,000 per police officer killed. In 1991, at the height of this campaign, the Medellin Police Department was losing officers at a rate that made the homicide statistics almost incomprehensible. Colombia recorded 27,000 murders in 1992, a rate that made it, statistically, the most violent country on earth that year. Medellin itself was the murder capital of the world. These are not television statistics. These are human beings. These are mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers. These are the people who lived in Medellin in the late 1980s and early 1990s, walking to work and shopping for groceries and sending their children to school in the shadow of a war that their government had been structurally unable to win, partly because the man waging it had spent years and billions of dollars ensuring that the institutions that should have contained him were riddled with his people. And through all of this, through every bombing, every assassination, every corrupted judge and police officer, there was a shadow over the entire story that Netflix barely mentioned. The CIA. This is the chapter Netflix never wrote. This is the part of the story that falls into the gap between what we can prove beyond legal doubt and what the evidence strongly, compellingly, uncomfortably suggests. This is where the story stops being a cops and robbers drama and starts being something more disturbing. A story about power and complicity and the particular cowardice of powerful nations when it comes to accounting for their own role in the disasters they help create. Let us be precise about what is established fact and what is established suspicion. In the early 1980s, the United States was deeply involved in Central America. The Reagan administration was fighting, in every available way, to prevent the spread of leftist governments in the region, particularly in Nicaragua, where the Sandinista government had taken power in 1979. To fight the Sandinistas, the CIA was funding, training, and equipping a rebel force known as the Contras. In 1984, the United States Congress, alarmed by the scope of American involvement in Nicaragua, passed the Boland Amendment, which explicitly prohibited any further American military or intelligence assistance to the Contras. The Reagan administration, faced with this legal prohibition, looked for other ways to fund the Contras. What followed became known as the Iran-Contra affair, a complex web of illegal arms deals and covert funding operations that represents one of the most significant political scandals in American history. Within this web, something emerged that is directly relevant to Pablo Escobar and the cocaine trade. In 1986, investigative journalist Robert Perry, working for the Associated Press, broke a story about the Nicaraguan Contras' involvement with cocaine trafficking. Perry's reporting, for which he later received the George Polk Award for National Reporting, one of journalism's most prestigious honors, documented that networks associated with the Contra funding operation were allowing cocaine to be transported through the same routes and logistics infrastructure that was being used to move money and arms. In 1996, journalist Gary Webb published his landmark Dark Alliance series in the San Jose Mercury News, which went further, documenting connections between CIA-supported Contra networks and the crack cocaine epidemic that had devastated African-American communities in Los Angeles and other American cities through the 1980s. Webb's reporting was initially attacked ferociously by the major American newspapers. His career was destroyed, and he died in 2004 under circumstances ruled a suicide. 2 decades later, the essential core of his reporting has been broadly validated. In 1998, the CIA's own Inspector General produced a report acknowledging that the CIA had been aware of drug trafficking by Contra networks and had failed to report it to the Department of Justice. Where does Pablo Escobar fit into this? He sits at the intersection of several uncomfortable realities. The Medellin cartel's cocaine was moving through some of the same Central American logistics corridors that the CIA was using or monitoring for its Contra operations. The question of what the CIA knew about these shipments, and what, if anything, they did to facilitate or ignore them in exchange for access to the network, remains formally unresolved, but informally damning. Juan Pablo Escobar, Pablo Escobar's son, now living under the name Sebastian Marroquin in Argentina, published a book in which he claimed his father worked with the CIA. This claim, made by a man with obvious complexity in his position, and therefore not to be taken without scrutiny, nonetheless aligns with what other sources have described. Former agents, former politicians, and investigative journalists have discussed these connections in documents that are in the public record. Robert Perry wrote explicitly that this connection is incontrovertible in the evidence, and that the old conventional wisdom of this being a conspiracy theory survived, even if the evidence is now clear. He noted that Netflix's Narcos wants to avoid the issue and pretends it did not happen. The Centra Spike program, which D. Agent Steve Murphy himself acknowledged as the mechanism for helping to identify new frequencies, and which was crucial in ultimately locating. Escobar in 1993 was a CIA intelligence operation using specially equipped aircraft to intercept radio communications. This same CIA infrastructure that eventually helped take Escobar down was, in an earlier era, operating in the same regional space as the cocaine networks. In 1982, Panamanian General Manuel Noriega, who was simultaneously on the CIA's payroll as an intelligence asset, allowed Pablo Escobar to ship cocaine through Panama. A Miami federal grand jury indicted the Medellin cartel's top leaders in 1984, specifically in connection with these Panamanian operations. The same General Noriega who was enabling Escobar was a paid CIA asset. The CIA's willingness to ignore, or at minimum not aggressively pursue, Noriega's drug trafficking activities for years, while he remained useful as an intelligence asset, is well documented. None of this means that the CIA ran the Medellin cartel. None of this means that the U.S. government created Pablo Escobar or controlled his operations. What it means, what the evidence strongly indicates, is that in the specific historical moment when the cocaine trade was exploding across the United States, a significant faction of the American national security establishment decided that stopping cocaine was less important than fighting communism in Central America, and that this decision, made by men in suits in Washington offices, men whose names appeared in no police files, men who attended no congressional hearings on the cocaine epidemic, had consequences for millions of people. The crack cocaine epidemic that ravaged American cities in the 1980s killed people. It destroyed families. It created the prison industrial complex that criminalized a generation of black and brown Americans. The connections between that epidemic and the political decisions made in Washington, the decisions that, at minimum, created space for the cocaine trade to flourish when it could have been interrupted, are real. They are documented, and they are absent from Netflix's Narcos. Because telling that story would require the show to complicate its own heroes. It would require examining not just the Colombian drug lord, but the American institutional choices that shaped the world he operated in. It would require a show that began as a crime drama to become something more, a political reckoning with what America did and did not do when it had power and chose how to use it. Netflix chose not to tell that story, so we are telling it here. D. Agent Steve Murphy arrived in Colombia in 1987. His partner Javier Pina arrived around the same time. They were not, in real life, the swaggering, hard-drinking cowboys that Pedro Pascal and Boyd Holbrook portrayed on television, or at least, as Murphy himself said when asked about the portrayal, we broke rules, policies and procedures every day, but we never broke the law, and we never had bottles of booze on our desks. The real story of Murphy and Pina is simultaneously more mundane and more frightening than the television version. They were professional men doing an extraordinarily dangerous job in a country that was, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, being torn apart from the inside. Pablo Escobar put a bounty on their heads, $300,000 each. In the Colombia of 1990, $300,000 was an almost incomprehensible sum to most people. Murphy and Pina were not abstract government adversaries to the cartel. They were targets with a price. And everyone in Medellin knew it. For the final 18 months before Escobar was killed, Murphy and Pina lived on a Colombian National Police military base. They did not go out casually. They did not walk the streets of Medellin in the evening and have dinners in restaurants. They existed within the fortress of official protection, because to do otherwise was to invite the bounty to be collected. Netflix showed Murphy's wife evacuating to Miami when the threats became too severe. Murphy's actual wife stayed in their home in Bogota. She was not happy that the show misrepresented this. a small lie embedded in a larger story, but symptomatic of how the show treated real people's lives as raw material to be reshaped for dramatic convenience. Murphy and Pina were not the heroes who brought down Pablo Escobar, in the sense the show implies, as though their personal skill and determination were the primary factors. The reality is more complicated. They were important parts of a large, international, multi-agency operation that also included hundreds of Colombian police officers. A special forces trained unit called the Search Block, the IA's Centra Spike surveillance program, the informant networks developed by the Search Block, and in ways that remain deeply controversial, the violent vigilante organization called Los Pepes. Javier Pina, the real Javier Pina, acknowledged in a public interview that he had unwittingly worked with a death squad leader to help locate Escobar in 1993. This admission, made casually, in the context of a speaking tour he and Murphy were doing after retirement, represents a significant revelation that Narcos never showed its audience. The USD agent who helped bring down Pablo Escobar did so partly through cooperation with a paramilitary death squad. Netflix's portrayal of Pina's involvement with the Cali cartel, which formed three, was fabricated. Pina's actual role was confined to the Medellin cartel investigation. Pedro Pascal was playing a fictionalized, dramatically convenient version of a real person, and that fictionalization was presented in a show that heavily emphasized its basis in reality. This matters not because it invalidates the show's entertainment value, but because the show's authority, its documentary-style editing, its use of real archival footage alongside the drama, its insistence on its factual grounding, was used to sell a story to millions of viewers who walked away believing they understood what actually happened. They did not. They understood what Netflix chose to show them. By 1991, Pablo Escobar is exhausted, not broken, not defeated, but worn down by the constant warfare, by the cascading international pressure, by the relentless manhunts, by the terror campaign that had transformed him from a feared but tolerated figure into a universally reviled one. The bombing of Avianca Flight 203 in particular had been a catastrophic miscalculation, killing 107 people, including 2 American D agents, had triggered a level of U.S. government engagement that made Colombia feel like an occupied territory. He has also paradoxically won something in 1991. Colombia adopts a new constitution, and in that new constitution, extradition is banned. Pablo Escobar's terror campaign, the bombs, the assassinations, the rivers of blood, has succeeded in its primary objective. He will not be extradited to the United States, faced with this concession, and facing a government that genuinely believes it cannot contain him militarily and is looking for a face-saving exit. Escobar negotiates a surrender. The terms are extraordinary. He will surrender to Colombian authorities. He will serve a sentence, 5 years on charges of drug trafficking and other crimes. He will not be extradited. He will not be held in a regular Colombian prison. He will instead serve his sentence in a facility he designs and builds himself, La Catedral. The name means the cathedral. It is situated high in the mountains above Envigado, southeast of Medellin. The location is deliberately chosen. Steep mountain topography surrounds it on multiple sides. The fog rolls in every evening after 6 o'clock and lifts at dawn, making aerial access difficult. Rival cartels cannot easily attack it. The military would struggle to assault it. The compound is built to Escobar's personal specifications, and the specifications are not those of a prison. La Catedral has a full-sized soccer field. It has a jacuzzi, a casino, a disco, a waterfall feature, a private suite for Escobar with a rotating bed, which is, even by the standards of everything else in this story, a memorable detail. There is a bar stocked with whatever Escobar desires. There are entertainment facilities. There are guest accommodations. The guards at La Catedral are Escobar's own men, not Colombian National Police officers, not army soldiers, Escobar's people. He has a helipad within the compound. He forces the closure of the airspace within a 10-kilometer radius of the complex so that no government aircraft can observe what is happening inside. He receives over 300 unauthorized visitors during his 13 months of confinement. Associates, business contacts, politicians, celebrities, a constant flow of people coming up the mountain to conduct business with the man who is technically in prison. He continues to run the Medellin cartel from inside La Catedral without meaningful interruption. He makes decisions. He issues orders. He manages disputes. He manages money. He is, in every practical sense, still in command of an empire. The prison is theater. The surrender is theater. Colombia has negotiated with Pablo Escobar, and the result is that Pablo Escobar gets to choose his own jail. This is what Netflix showed you. What Netflix was less explicit about is something darker, reported in detail by the one source that saw everything. What happened to the workers who built La Catedral? According to multiple accounts of people with direct knowledge of the construction, all 300 architects and laborers who built the compound, the people who knew the location of the underground passages, the escape routes, the secret infrastructure built into the facility, were reportedly killed after construction was completed. They vanished, one by one. Some accounts say their bodies are buried somewhere on or near the grounds. Bags of bones have reportedly been found in the vicinity over the years. This has never been formally investigated by Colombian authorities in any comprehensive way. It remains the kind of story that circulates in Medellin, among people who were there, in the shadow history that lies beneath the official record. Then, on July 22, 1992, something happens inside La Catedral that even the Colombian government, with all its compromises and accommodations, cannot ignore. Fernando Galino and Gerardo Kiko Moncada drive up the mountain to meet with Escobar. They are two of his most senior cartel associates, men who have been loyal and profitable parts of the Medellin operation for years. The reason for the meeting is a financial dispute. Galeno and Moncada have been accumulating money without reporting all of it to Escobar, and Escobar has found out. They never come down from the mountain. Escobar has them both tortured and killed inside La Catedral. Their bodies are removed in secret. This, the murder of two men inside his own prison during his own period of supposed incarceration, is the moment that breaks the government's willingness to pretend the arrangement is working. Officials arrive at La Catedral to inform Escobar that he will be transferred to a regular prison. What happens next is disputed in its details, but the outcome is clear. Escobar holds the arriving officials hostage briefly, then uses the resulting chaos to escape. Netflix's Narcos portrays this escape as a dramatic, cinematic event with large-scale violence. The accounts of Escobar's son and others who examined the episode closely suggest it was more prosaic. When the government announced the transfer, Escobar slipped out through a section of the outer wall that he had deliberately ordered be built with weak mortar, an escape route he had engineered into the construction of his own prison from the very beginning. He had always planned to leave. One guard was killed in the escape, not a dramatic battle, a single death, and then Pablo Escobar walked into the Colombian mountains, and the greatest manhunt in the history of South America began. The search block is established as the specific unit dedicated to finding Pablo Escobar. It is 600 men, specially trained by the United States Delta Force and Navy SEALs. It is commanded by Colonel Hugo Martinez, a Colombian national police officer of considerable tactical ability and personal courage. The Colombian government places a bounty on Escobar's head, $6 million, an enormous sum. What is less prominently discussed, what Netflix acknowledged, but did not fully examine, is the parallel operation that was running alongside the search block. The operation that had no official existence. The operation that was doing the things the official operation could not legally do. Los Pepis Perseguidos por Pablo Escobar. People persecuted by Pablo Escobar. The organization was created in early 1993 by Fidel Castano Gil, a man whose history deserves its own story. Castano was himself a former drug trafficker, a paramilitary leader, and by some accounts at least as capable of extraordinary violence as Escobar himself. The breaking point for Castano, the moment that transformed him from a criminal associate of Escobar's into a mortal enemy, came when Galeno and Moncada were killed inside La Catedral. Castano had been scheduled to attend that meeting. He chose not to go. His decision saved his life, and it turned him into a man with a singular mission: destroy Pablo Escobar. Los Pepis was nominally presented as a victim-led organization, people who had suffered at Escobar's hands, coming together to take justice into their own hands. There was some truth in this. The organization drew in people who had genuinely lost family members to Escobar's violence. But the leadership was cartel. The funding was cartel. Specifically, the Cali cartel, Escobar's longtime rivals, who were more than happy to finance an organization that was systematically destroying their competition. Los Pepis did not observe any of the legal restrictions that bound the Colombian National Police or the American advisors. They bombed properties associated with Escobar. They killed his lawyers, his associates, his accountants, his logistical support network. They targeted people connected to Escobar who had no direct involvement in his drug operations: secretaries, drivers, cousins, anyone who could conceivably be providing him with any form of assistance. In February 1993, the CIA formally complained that government forces in Colombia were sharing intelligence with Los Pepis. Think about what this means. The American CIA was complaining in an internal government document that became public that Colombian authorities were feeding information to a paramilitary death squad. The CIA, which was itself involved through the Centrist Spite program in the surveillance operation targeting Escobar, was raising objections not to the outcome, finding and killing Escobar, but to the particular mésages of how the intelligence was being shared and used. The complaint was noted. The information continued to flow. This is the real story of how Pablo Escobar was found and killed. Not a clean, principled law enforcement operation. Not a story of agents riding into the sunset after a triumph of professional investigative work. A story in which a death squad operating outside any legal framework, funded by a rival cartel, fed by intelligence from a nominally law-abiding government unit, working in the same operational space as American intelligence services. All of these things were happening simultaneously, and the result was the death of Pablo Escobar on a rooftop. The real agent Javier Pina looked back on this in retirement and acknowledged it directly. He had worked, unknowingly, with a death squad leader. He said so publicly. He did not hide it, but Netflix, which dramatized his character across 3 seasons of a hit show, chose not to dramatize this particular aspect of his actual biography. The question of what Colombia's national police knew, what American advisors knew, and what decisions were made about working with Los Pepis is one that Colombian society is still, decades later, processing. Several senior Colombian police officers who were involved in the search block operation have been investigated or accused over the years in connection with extrajudicial killings carried out during the manhunt. The lines between the official and unofficial operations were, in practice, very blurry. This is not to say that the people who caught Escobar were as bad as Escobar. They were not. No equivalence between a state attempting, however imperfectly, to enforce the law, and a man who bombed passenger planes and assassinated presidential candidates is warranted. But the comfortable moral clarity of the Netflix narrative, brave agents versus the monster, does not survive honest examination. The world does not divide cleanly into the brave and the evil. It divides into the complicated and the very complicated. That is the truth that was hidden. Pablo Escobar escaped La Catedral on July 22, 1992. He was killed on December 2, 1993. In between those dates, 499 days, he lived the life of a fugitive in a city that simultaneously sheltered him and was trying to kill him. The Medellin of those months is almost unimaginable. The murder rate in 1992 was the highest ever recorded in a major city anywhere in the world. Los Pepes was killing people connected to Escobar at a consistent pace. The search block was raiding properties, interrogating associates, building the intelligence picture that would eventually narrow Escobar to a single house on a single street. American surveillance aircraft were circling overhead, intercepting communications, mapping patterns. And Escobar was moving, constantly. He maintained a discipline of never spending more than 2 consecutive nights in the same location. He rotated through a network of safe houses provided by the web of poor Medellin families and low-level associates who remained loyal to him. He kept his team small. At the end, he had only a single bodyguard. El Liman. His family was in danger. His wife Maria Victoria and his children, Juan Pablo and Manuela, were targeted by Los Pepes and became, in a cruel irony, the instruments that eventually led to his death. Because Escobar loved his family, it was, by almost all accounts, one of the few unconditional attachments in his life. He spoke to them regularly. He needed to know they were safe. And the phone calls he made to check on them were the one security vulnerability that is enormous. Practical intelligence could not fully suppress. His children were moved around as well. His son Juan Pablo, in one period, was in a Bogota hotel that Los Pepes bombed. His daughter Manuela, as mentioned earlier, was with him in a safe house on a night so cold that Escobar burned $2 million in cash to keep her warm. These are not the acts of a man who was invulnerable or untouchable. These are the acts of a father, using the only currency he had left, trying to protect a child. Sebastian Marroquin, Juan Pablo Escobar, now living under his chosen name in Argentina, has spoken extensively about this period. His memoir and his later documentary work paints a picture of a family trapped between a father they loved and feared, and the institutions of the Colombian and American states that wanted to use them as bait. He has described being essentially a hostage of the Colombian government during this period, nominally under state protection, but in practice unable to leave freely, their every movement monitored. The district attorney's office around them, infiltrated by Cali cartel operatives. In Marroquin's account of this period, there is a detail that is both heartbreaking and revealing. During the months when the family was in Bogota, trying to seek asylum somewhere, any country that would take them, Juan Pablo was trying to communicate with his father in ways that didn't expose either of them. The surveillance net around them was tightening. His father, the most wanted man in the world, was calling from rotating numbers and keeping conversations short, but not short enough. The Colombian Signals Intelligence Team, using American Centra-Spike technology, was getting better at their work as the months went on. They were getting faster at triangulating signals. The window of safety for a phone call was shrinking. Escobar, who understood this intellectually, could not always stop himself emotionally. The calls to his family kept getting made. They kept getting shorter, and the triangulation kept getting closer in the final months before his death. Escobar also wrote letters, long, emotional, politically articulate letters that were addressed to journalists, to government officials, to the public. He offered to surrender again. He proposed terms, he argued, in some letters, that the entire war on drugs was a fiction designed to serve American geopolitical interests, an argument that, irony of ironies, had more than a little factual substance to it. He was not a stupid man. He was a criminal who had, over the years of his empire, developed a sophisticated understanding of geopolitics and institutional power. But he was also, in these final months, increasingly isolated in a way that his intelligence could not fully compensate for. He had started with an empire of thousands of people and billions of dollars. He had ended up in a borrowed house with one bodyguard and a radio. And on the evening of December 1st, 1993, his 44th birthday, he celebrated in the only way available to him: cake, wine, and marijuana in the house on Kale 79B in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellin. Whether he knew it was his last birthday is a question his family has thought about. His son believes he did. His son believes that his father, at some level, had accepted what was coming. The next day, December 2nd, 1993, Pablo Escobar picked up the phone and called his son. The phone call that ended Pablo Escobar's life lasted approximately 90 seconds. The moment the call was identified as coming from Escobar, based on voice recognition and the fact that it was made to his son, Juan Pablo's number, the search block was mobilized. The Colombian electronic surveillance team triangulated the signal to the Los Olivos neighborhood. The search block converged on the area. Within hours, they had narrowed it to the house on Kale 79B, a modest, two-story residence in a middle-class neighborhood that was, in every visible respect, completely unremarkable. They surrounded the house. The perimeter went up. There was no large visible security presence outside, no cars, no visible guards. Escobar had been hiding in plain sight, the most elementary of disguises, when the search block breached the door. Pablo Escobar and his last bodyguard, El Liman, were inside. They ran. They went upstairs. They found a window at the back, and they attempted to escape across the rooftops, a tactic that had worked for Escobar in other situations. A movement across the connected roofs of the neighborhood that someone who knew the area and moved fast might have used to put distance between himself and his pursuers. He did not know the area well enough. He did not move fast enough. His bodyguard El Liman was shot and killed on the rooftop. Pablo Escobar was shot multiple times, in the torso, the leg, and behind the ear. He fell, and then the question. The bullet behind the ear, the fatal shot. Colombian police and military forces, in the official account, shot Escobar in the course of a legitimate law enforcement operation. 3 police officers were identified as having fired the shots that killed him. The Colombian National Police celebrated the operation as a triumph. Colonel Martinez's son, a young officer who had been working alongside his father in the search block, was present at the scene, but the location of the shot behind the ear, the execution style, single bullet to the head, gave Escobar's family pause and continues to give historians pause. Roberto Escobar, Pablo's older brother, and other family members have insisted from the beginning that Pablo Escobar shot himself. This was not a position adopted out of grief or denial. It was based on something they say Pablo told them directly. Repeatedly, over the years, he always said he would never be taken alive. He always said that if he was cornered, if there was no way out, he would use the gun on himself rather than be captured. The location of the fatal wound, behind the ear, the specific placement Pablo had described when explaining what he would do, was, in the family's account, evidence that he kept his word, the DEA's position. As Pedro Pascal himself stated publicly during the Narcos promotional period, is that the agents do not believe Escobar killed himself. The official Colombian government position is that police shot him. A further complication came years later when Diego Fernando Murillo Bejarano, a former paramilitary leader and drug lord, a man who knew the criminal landscape of that era, intimately published a memoir in which he claimed that a associated with Los Pepes, had actually fired the fatal shot. That the killing blow was not from Colombian law enforcement, but from the paramilitary death squad that had been operating in the shadows of the official manhunt for months. Colombian General Hugo Martinez rejected this claim directly and firmly. According to CIA documents released in 2008, General Miguel Antonio Gómez Padilla, a Colombian National Police Director General, had worked with Fidel Castano, the paramilitary leader of Los Pepes, in matters of intelligence collection during the manhunt. The existence of this documented cooperation between the head of Colombia's national police and the paramilitary leader who had spent months killing Escobar's associates is not in dispute. 3 competing accounts, 3 possible endings. The official law enforcement story, the suicide story, the Los Pepes story. The truth is that we do not know with certainty which bullet killed Pablo Escobar. The investigation of his death was not conducted with the forensic rigor that a civilized society applies to homicides. Because the death of Pablo Escobar was not treated as a homicide, it was treated as a victory. And victories are celebrated, not investigated. The photographs taken in the immediate aftermath, the triumphant police officers standing over the body, lifting the head for the cameras, were criticized internationally as undignified and unprofessional. These are the images that went around the world. These are the images that told the story. The monster was dead, but what actually happened on that rooftop, in the final seconds of Pablo Escobar's life, is a question that remains. What does not remain in question is the aftermath, celebrations in Bogotá, grief in the barrios of Medellin, 2 Colombias, brought face to face with each other by the death of one man. Of all the stories connected to Pablo Escobar that Netflix never told, the one that most deserves to be told is this one. The story of the boy who grew up as the son of the most dangerous criminal in the world, who loved his father and was trapped by his father's choices, and who eventually built a life from the rubble. Juan Pablo Escobar was born in 1977. He was 16 years old when his father was killed on that rooftop in Medellin. He has spent the years since then doing something extraordinary, facing what his father was, under the name Sebastian Marroquin, a name deliberately chosen to sever his public identity from his father's. He became an architect and a writer. He wrote a memoir. He produced a documentary. He traveled to meet the sons of men his father had killed, specifically the son of Colombia's murdered Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, whom Escobar had ordered assassinated in 1984. He met with the son of presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán, whose father was shot dead at a political rally in 1989. These encounters, a man who loved his father meeting the children of people his father had murdered, asking and receiving forgiveness, attempting to build something human out of the wreckage of history, are the most genuinely emotional and morally serious story in the entire Escobar saga. They are the story that takes the spectacle of the cartel and demands that it be reckoned with on a human scale. Netflix gave you the spectacle. It gave you the raids and the explosions and the car chases and the D agents with their sunglasses and their swagger. It gave you the drama of the empire. It did not give you the man who grew up inside the empire's shadow and chose to walk toward the people his father had destroyed and ask them to look him in the eye. Marroquin has described, in various interviews, what it was like to be Pablo Escobar's son. The fear, the constant security, the impossibility of a normal childhood. But also, and this is the part that is hardest to hear, the love. His father was present in his life. He took him to soccer games. He built him things. He read to him. He was, by his son's account, a genuinely loving father in the private hours of a life that was defined publicly by violence. This is not an exoneration. A man who loved his children and ordered the murders of thousands of other people's children is not, by virtue of his private tenderness, absolved. But it is the truth of who Pablo Escobar was. Not a cartoon villain, not a simple monster, but a human being of enormous complexity who made choices that cost the world immeasurably. In his memoir, Marroquin listed 28 errors in Narcos Season 2 in a public Facebook post that received international attention. The errors ranged from trivial. Escobar was a fan of Deportivo Independiente Medellin, not Atletico Nacional, as the show depicted, an error that is, in Soccer Mag Colombia, more than trivial to substantive. His uncle Carlos Hanao was depicted as a drug trafficker and given a death that involved an alleged confrontation, when in reality, he was kidnapped and tortured by Los Pepes and was, by his nephew's account, a man of impeccable character. His grandmother, Escobar's mother, was depicted in the show in ways that the family disputes. His mother never spoke with journalist Virginia Vallejo after escaping La Catedral. The district attorney who appeared to be protecting the family was, in Marroquin's account, not a helper, but a representative of a system infiltrated by the Cali cartel, making the family effective hostages of the state while presenting themselves as protectors. Marroquin's corrections were not, in the main, corrections of dramatic license in the way that all adaptations involve. They were corrections of a pattern of the show taking real people, including his family, and reshaping them for dramatic convenience in ways that cause real damage to real reputations and real lives. The show never acknowledged these corrections publicly. Netflix declined to amend anything. When Escobar was killed in December 1993, the Medellin cartel effectively ceased to function as a significant force. Its infrastructure had been dismantled by the search block, its financial networks disrupted, its key personnel killed, jailed, or scattered. But cocaine did not stop. The world did not stop wanting cocaine. The United States did not stop consuming cocaine. The demand that had made Pablo Escobar worth $30 billion remained constant. All that changed was who supplied it. The Cali cartel, the organization led by the Rodriguez Orellana brothers and Jose Santa Cruz Londoco, which had been operating parallel to and competing with Medellin for years, stepped smoothly into the vacuum, where the Medellin cartel was defined by violence and confrontation. The Cali cartel preferred a more corporate model. They bribed more and bombed less. They cultivated political connections more carefully and military confrontations less eagerly. They were, in the language of the American businessmen, they were becoming rich alongside, better operators. For a brief period in the mid-1990s, the Cali cartel controlled an estimated 80% of the global cocaine supply, the same market share that Medellin had once held. In 1995 and 1996, the Colombian government, under pressure from the United States, moved against Cali. Top cartel members were arrested. The Cali kingpins were eventually behind bars. Narcos Seasons 3 and 4 dramatized this story with Pedro Pascal's Javier Pina character at the center of it, except that the real Javier Pina's involvement with the Cali cartel investigation was essentially fabricated for dramatic purposes. His role, as he himself has confirmed, was in the Medellin investigation. The show needed him as an anchor, a continuity character to carry viewers from one cartel story to the next, and so it invented a role for him that he did not actually have. This is worth sitting with. A show that used archival footage of real events, that had real D agents as technical consultants, that was sold to its audience as a factual account of what really happened. That show invented a major character's central actions in two entire seasons because the true story didn't fit the narrative structure they wanted. The real story of the Cali cartel's takedown involved different people, Colombian law enforcement, different American intelligence assets, political decisions made in Bogota and Washington that are their own complex story. But that story did not have a pre-existing character that audiences knew and loved. So Netflix built one, the migration of cocaine power from Colombia to Mexico, which happened gradually through the 1990s and accelerated through the 2000s, is the most significant development in the history of the drug trade since Escobar himself, as the Colombian cartels fell, or were forced to reorganize into smaller, less visible operations. The Mexican networks that had been handling transshipment duties for the Colombians grew more powerful. The Sinaloa cartel, the Gulf cartel, and eventually the full landscape of Mexican drug trafficking organizations took control of the cocaine supply chain. El Chapo, Joaquin Guzman Lora, became the face of the next era, the name that replaced Escobar's as the most recognized in international drug enforcement. But El Chapo, for all his notoriety and his extraordinary escape from Mexican prison, was never the industrial-scale global phenomenon that Escobar represented at his peak. The real D-Agent Pina himself knocked down the popular rumor that Escobar and El Chapo ever met in Colombia, a story that circulates persistently, but that Pina, with direct knowledge of the era, dismisses in 1992. Medellin was the most dangerous city on earth. The homicide rate was extraordinary, even by the standards of cities that had been through wars. In a single year, the city recorded murders at a rate that no major metropolitan area had come close to. Today, Medellin is a different city. It would be an exaggeration to say that the transformation is complete, or that it is without complications. Drug trafficking continues in Colombia, organized through different, smaller, more diffuse networks. Medellin has neighborhoods that remain dangerous. Poverty and inequality, the root conditions that Pablo Escobar grew up in and exploited, have not been eliminated. But the city that gave the world Pablo Escobar has also given the world something remarkable, evidence that transformation is possible. The cable car systems that connect Medellin's poor hillside neighborhoods to the city center, the world-class libraries built in the barrios, the urban renewal projects in the comunas, the poor neighborhoods where Escobar once walked as a hero, that have turned some of the most violent areas in the city into places of genuine community life. The retired D-agents Steve Murphy and Javier Pina, speaking at a Chicago event in 2022, said they were proud that Medellin was no longer the murder capital of the world. It was a simple statement. It carried the weight of everything they had witnessed in that city during the years when it was trying to tear itself apart. The Hacienda Naples, the vast estate with the dinosaur statues and the zoo and the bullring, was seized by the Colombian government after Escobar's death. For years it sat empty and looted, local people carrying off whatever they could. Eventually it was converted into a theme park. Tourists can visit it today. The front gate still carries the little white plane that Escobar mounted there as a trophy of his first drug run to the United States. The zoo, long since emptied of its exotic animals, is now a children's water park, and the hippos still roam the rivers. There are approximately 150 of them now. Scientists and wildlife authorities have debated for years about what to do. Culling them is controversial. Relocating them is expensive and logistically daunting. Sterilizing them is slow. The most likely outcome, many biologists now believe, is that the Colombian river hippo population will continue to grow and spread indefinitely. A species native to Africa has established itself in South America because one man imported 4 of them for his private zoo in the 1980s. They have survived everything. They have outlasted the cartel, the search block, the D, and every Colombian government initiative. They are, in their way, the most durable legacy of Pablo Escobar. In the immediate years after Escobar's death, a significant and unresolved question lingered. Where was the money? Pablo Escobar's personal fortune was estimated at $25 to $30 billion at its peak. Of that, a substantial portion was accounted for, confiscated, spent, given away, burned, or eaten by rats. But substantial is a relative term when you begin with $30 billion. Even accounting for the most conservative estimates of losses, the sums that remain unaccounted for are staggering. Escobar was known to have buried cash in fields, in walls, in the grounds of properties across Colombia. He had money in Panama, in Swiss bank accounts, in real estate holdings across multiple countries held through layers of shell companies. The pursuit of this money occupied Colombian and American financial investigators for years after his death. Two former CIA operations officers, Ben Smith and Doug Locks, spent years investigating the question of Escobar's hidden fortune, which became the basis for a Discovery Channel series called Finding Escobar's Millions. Using sophisticated electromagnetic sensors, drone technology, and forensic analysis, they searched properties and spoke with people who had direct knowledge of the cartel's financial operations. They found some things. They did not find the main cash. By most informed estimates, billions of dollars in Pablo Escobar's money remain hidden somewhere in Colombia, in walls of houses, in fields, in the beds of rivers. Some of it has probably rotted into meaninglessness. Cash does not keep well in tropical conditions. A fact Escobar himself acknowledged. Some of it was found and quietly pocketed by people who never told anyone. Some of it may genuinely still be there, waiting. There is a story, corroborated by family members and associates, that Escobar had a system of coded maps, that the locations of his principal stashes were encoded in documents or items that only he fully understood. Whether those maps exist, whether anyone has them, whether they have ever been decoded, these are questions that Colombian treasure hunters and investigators have spent decades trying to answer. What is certain is that the drug trade Escobar pioneered generated an amount of money that fundamentally distorted the Colombian economy and Colombian society in ways that are still being felt. The narco money that flowed through Medellin in the 1980s inflated property values, corrupted institutions at every level, funded the paramilitaries that went on to wage their own wars in the 1990s and 2000s, and created dependencies and patterns that do not simply dissolve when the original source is eliminated. The money moved. It became legitimate businesses. It became political donations. It became real estate. It became university tuitions for the children of people who never asked where the original money came from. The laundering of Pablo Escobar's money, the transformation of cocaine profits into respectable economic activity, was a project that employed thousands of people, some of whom knew exactly what they were doing, and some of whom chose not to know. This is another story Netflix did not tell, the money story. Not the colorful details of rubber bands and burned bills, but the systematic, institutional story of how billions of dollars of cocaine money moved through the Colombian and international financial system, how it was absorbed into the legitimate economy, and who benefited from that absorption. The terror campaign that Pablo Escobar waged against Colombia in the years between 1984 and his surrender in 1991 killed thousands of people. Judges, politicians, police officers, journalists, people sitting on airplanes, people walking past government buildings when truck bombs went off outside, and it worked. This is the most disturbing part of the legacy, the part that history books and television dramas tend to gloss over. Pablo Escobar waged a terror campaign against the Colombian state with a specific objective, the elimination of extradition to the United States. He achieved that objective. In 1991, the new Colombian constitution banned extradition. Pablo Escobar murdered his way to a constitutional amendment. The lesson this taught, not just in Colombia, but everywhere, is one of the most troubling in modern criminal history. It is the lesson that a sufficiently violent, sufficiently well-funded, sufficiently strategic criminal organization can, with enough persistence and enough blood, force a democracy to change its laws. Colombia eventually reinstituted extradition in 1997. After Escobar's death, after the Cali cartel had risen and fallen, after the political will had been rebuilt through the sacrifice of new generations of prosecutors and judges and police officers who chose to hold the line. But it took years. It came after thousands of deaths. And the period during which extradition was banned gave the drug trade years of additional operation under a protective legal umbrella that Escobar had paid for in blood. The three presidential candidates murdered on Escobar's orders: Luis Carlos Galán in 1989, Bernardo Jaramillo Ossa in 1990, Carlos Pizarro Lengomez in 1990. Three men running for the presidency of Colombia. Three men who represented different visions of what the country could be. Three men killed by the same cartel within a single period of political violence that has no parallel in any democratic country's modern history. Colombia held elections anyway. Cesar Gaviria was elected president in 1990, running explicitly in tribute to his murdered colleague Galán, explicitly pro-extradition, and then once in office, presiding over the negotiated surrender that gave Escobar la Catedral and the Constitutional Convention that gave him the extradition ban he had paid for in those presidential lives. The politics of survival in a country being bombed and shot at are different from the politics of principle in a country at peace. This is not a criticism of individual Colombian politicians. It is an observation about what happens to societies under sustained terrorist pressure. They adapt. They compromise. They look for any path that reduces the immediate violence, even at the cost of longer-term principle. But the lesson was learned, and the lesson is, it is possible to bomb and murder your way to political change. Colombia's experience with Escobar is a case study in precisely that, and it has been studied and adapted and applied in various forms by criminal and terrorist organizations across the world in the decades since. This is the legacy that is never discussed in the glamorized narco culture that Escobar's story has generated. The influence on the drug trade, the influence on narco-terrorism as a tactic, the proof of concept that a criminal organization can effectively hold a state hostage. Netflix's Narcos premiered in August 2015. It was an immediate international phenomenon. It ran for 3 seasons covering the Colombian cartels, then extended into Narcos, Mexico for 4 additional seasons covering the Mexican drug trade. By any measure of cultural impact, it was one of the most globally influential crime dramas ever made. The show used a documentary style with genuine archival footage intercut with dramatizations. It hired real D-agents as technical consultants. It filmed in actual locations in Colombia. The opening credits showed historical photographs. The narration, delivered in English by Boyd Holbrook as Steve Murphy, had the cadence of a documentary voiceover. This was all deliberate. The documentary aesthetic was designed to lend the show authority, to create in viewers the feeling that they were watching historical truth, not historical fiction, and it worked. Millions of viewers came away from Narcos believing they had a solid factual understanding of Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. But the gap between what the show told and what actually happened is significant. Not in every detail. Many of the broad strokes are accurate, and the production team did substantial research. But in specific, meaningful ways that matter. The portrayal of Javier Pina's role in the Cali cartel investigation was invented. His actual role was confined to the Medellin years. This is not a minor creative liberty. It is the fabrication of a central character's central actions across 2 entire seasons. The CIA's role in the cocaine trade, the connections that informed journalists and the CIA's own Inspector General have documented, was essentially omitted. The show tells a story of brave American agents fighting a drug lord. It does not tell a story of an American national security establishment that made decisions in the 1980s that prioritized fighting communism over stopping cocaine. with profound consequences for American cities and Colombian communities. The death of Escobar is presented by the show as a straightforward law enforcement victory. Colombian police, aided by the D, locate and shoot the most wanted man in Colombia. The involvement of Los Pepis, the documented cooperation between the official investigation and the paramilitary death squad. The CIA documents showing the Colombian National Police Director working with Los Pepis leadership. The alternative theories about the killing shot. These are present in the show only in shadow, not examined with anything like the scrutiny they deserve. Pablo Escobar's son, Sebastian Marroquin, published 28 specific corrections to the show's second season alone. He was not attacking the show for being unflattering to his father. He explicitly understood why dramatizations would treat his father harshly. And in many respects, he agrees with that treatment. He was attacking it for being careless with the truth about specific individuals, including family members who were misrepresented in ways that were hurtful and inaccurate. The show supported the wrong football club for Escobar, Atlético Nacional, instead of Deportivo Independiente Medellin. In soccer-mad Colombia, this is not a small error. But beyond the corrections of individual facts, there is a larger issue. The show built a mythology. It took a story that was genuinely complex, morally, politically, institutionally, and turned it into something that a global audience could watch in their living rooms and feel they understood. The complexity was not fully erased, but it was managed, contained, made safe for consumption. The CIA connection was erased. The paramilitary involvement was managed. The Robin Hood paradox was acknowledged, but not fully examined. The corruption of American institutions was absent. The consequences for the poor communities that Escobar both helped and destroyed were present as background, texture, but never as foreground examination. Television dramas are not documentaries. They are not obligated to tell the full truth. But when a television drama is sold with the explicit authority of documentary aesthetics, when it presents itself as the true story, when it sends its viewers away believing they know what happened, it takes on a responsibility that Narcos did not fully honor. This is not a condemnation of the show's entertainment value. It is entertaining. Some of the performances are extraordinary. The cinematography of Colombia is gorgeous. As a piece of television drama, it earns much of the acclaim it received. But as a history, as the story it claimed to be, it is incomplete in ways that matter. December 2nd, 1993. The body on the rooftop, the celebrations in the street, the grief in the barrios. What came next? The immediate aftermath in Colombia was a period of complicated, incomplete transition. The Medellin cartel, without Escobar, essentially dissolved. Its members scattered. Some were killed, some were captured. Some integrated into the Cali cartel's operation. Some went independent. Some retired with whatever fortune they had accumulated and tried to become ordinary people. The Cali cartel's moment of dominance was brief. By 1995 and 1996, under the Gaviria administration's successor, Ernesto Samper, the Colombian government, under enormous pressure from the United States, which had actually accused Samper himself of receiving cartel money for his presidential campaign, moved against the Cali leadership. The Rodriguez Oriela brothers were arrested. Jose Santa Cruz Londoco was killed. By 1996, the Cali kingpins were in Colombian prisons, and the organization was effectively dismantled. This was not the end of Colombian drug trafficking. It was the end of the era of the giant, vertically integrated, identifiable cartel, the era of the single dominant organization, whose name the whole world knew and whose leader's face appeared in magazines. What replaced it was more diffuse, harder to target, and in many ways more resilient. Smaller organizations, looser networks, paramilitary groups with drug trafficking sidelines, regional operations without a single dominant personality. and then the shift to Mexico. This migration happened gradually and was driven by geography, logistics, and the simple business logic of supply chains. The Colombian producers still grew the coca and processed the cocaine, but the transshipment routes, the pathways that moved product from Colombia into the United States, increasingly ran through Mexico, and the Mexican organizations that controlled those routes grew powerful on the fees they charged. As they grew powerful, they began to take control of larger portions of the supply chain. By the early 2000s, the Mexican cartels were not just transshippers. They were traffickers in their own right, buying Colombian product wholesale and managing their own distribution networks in the United States. The Sinaloa cartel, under El Chapo, became the most powerful drug trafficking organization in the world. El Chapo was eventually arrested, twice, escaping prison once in spectacular fashion. In a tunnel his people had dug beneath the shower of his prison cell, in an escape so elaborate it could only have been facilitated by massive corruption at every level of the Mexican prison system. He was eventually extradited to the United States, the extradition that Pablo Escobar killed thousands of people to prevent, and convicted in 2019, sentenced to life in an American supermax prison. The irony is precise. The outcome Escobar sacrificed everything to prevent was eventually delivered to his successor. El Chapo sits in an American prison today. Pablo Escobar died on a rooftop rather than allow it. Whether this represents justice, irony, or simply the grinding indifference of historical outcomes is a question without a clean answer. Pablo Escobar has become one of the most recognizable faces in the world. His image appears on T-shirts sold in markets from Bangkok to Buenos Aires. His mugshot, the 1976 photograph of him in a white shirt, relaxed, almost amused, looking directly at the camera with the confidence of a man who knows the handcuffs won't hold, is reproduced endlessly. His name functions as shorthand in a dozen languages for a certain kind of criminal genius, a certain kind of outsized, larger-than-life criminal ambition. Medellin has grappled with this in conflicted, uncomfortable ways. The city that Escobar terrorized and built housing in and used as his personal empire has become, in certain respects, a destination for a specific kind of dark tourism. People come to see the sights. La Catedral, Hacienda Naples, the neighborhood of La Candelaria, where he grew up, the graves, the murals, the places where the history happened. Many Colombians find this deeply objectionable. They have worked for 30 years to build a city and a country that is defined by something other than cocaine and murder. They have rebuilt institutions. They have invested in innovation. They have told the story of Medellin's transformation in international forums as a model of urban resilience. And then foreign tourists arrive and want to see the Escobar sites, and want to have their photographs taken where he died and wear T-shirts with his face. The tension between the commercial value of Escobar's story and the human cost of that story is not resolvable. Both things are true, that Pablo Escobar's life is one of the most compelling narratives in modern history, and that celebrating it without confronting what it cost is a moral failure. Netflix, by making Narcos a global phenomenon, contributed to both sides of this. The show brought millions of people into contact with Colombian history who would never have encountered it otherwise. It generated enormous interest in Medellin as a city, contributing to the tourism economy that Colombians are in some ways grateful for, and in others, deeply uncomfortable with. And it shaped the global understanding of what happened, an understanding that is, as we have discussed, significantly incomplete. The narco culture that Escobar's story has generated, the music, corridos, the fashion, the Escobar aesthetic, the Netflix aesthetic of the cartel drama, the dozens of books and documentaries and dramatizations, exists in a permanent tension with the reality of what that culture was built on. Thousands of graves, destroyed families, corruption that undermined democracy for decades. A generation of Colombian children who grew up in a country at war with itself. Sebastian Marroquin has spoken about this with remarkable clarity. He does not glorify his father. He does not deny what his father did. He spends his time and his platform trying to shift the conversation from fascination with the spectacle to reckoning with the cost. He is, in the landscape of people who were directly formed by Pablo Escobar's story, perhaps the most honest witness. We have come a long way from that rooftop. We have gone back to the farm in Rio Negro, to the child who stole tombstones and sold fake diplomas. We have followed him through the contraband years and into the cocaine boom, through the founding of the cartel and the building of the empire, through the political ambitions and their violent consequences, through the terror campaign and the luxury prison and the escape and the manhunt. We have arrived at the rooftop, and we have sat with the question that remains unanswered. And we have gone further into the spaces Netflix did not go, into the CIA-shaped shadow over the cocaine trade, into the paramilitary death squads that operated alongside the official manhunt, into the real story of the D-agents who admitted they worked with people they should not have worked with, into the 28 errors that the killer's own son cataloged and published for the world to see. What is the final truth about Pablo Escobar? He was born into a country that had abandoned its poor. He grew up watching money and power being exercised without accountability. He decided that the rules, the laws, the institutions, the social contract applied to people who had something to lose, and that he had nothing to lose. He was right, and then he was wrong. And the distance between those two moments was $30 billion and 4,000 graves. He was a product of specific historical conditions. The poverty of Medellin in the 1960s, the cocaine boom of the 1970s, the structural corruption of Colombian institutions, the CIA's decision to look the other way at cocaine trafficking in exchange for anti-communist cooperation, the failure of the Colombian state to provide the poor with any alternative to the only latter being offered. All of these things are true, and he was also a man who made choices. He chose to kill Rodrigo Lara Bonilla. He chose to bomb Avianca Flight 203. He chose to murder Fernando Galino and Gerardo Moncada inside his own prison. He chose, again and again, to respond to opposition with death. His circumstances explain some of who he became. They do not explain those choices. Those were his. The most troubling aspect of the Escobar legacy is not the violence. Violence, however extreme, fits into comprehensible categories. The most troubling aspect is the love. The people who genuinely loved him, who loved him not out of fear, not because he paid them, but because he had built them houses and lit their soccer fields and shown up when the government had not. The children who grew up in houses he funded, the families in the barrios who protected him during his last year, not because he threatened them, but because they had a bond with him that was real. A society that produces a Pablo Escobar, that creates the conditions under which his particular combination of ambition, violence, and generosity could make him a beloved figure to hundreds of thousands of people, is a society that has failed its poor in a fundamental, structural way. The problem Escobar represented was not solved by his death. It was not solved by the dismantling of the Medellin cartel. It was not solved by the arrests of the Cali Rodriguez Orielas. The problem was, and is, poverty, inequality, the institutional abandonment of the forgotten, and the willingness of powerful nations to manage the symptoms of these problems with violence and incarceration, rather than addressing the causes. The war on drugs, which framed the American government's role in the Escobar story, has by almost every measure failed. More drugs flow into the United States today than at any point during the years when Pablo Escobar was alive. More Americans die of drug-related causes annually than died in the entire Vietnam War. The cartels that followed the Medellin cartel are, in aggregate, more powerful, more diffuse, and more resistant to law enforcement than anything Escobar built. The rooftop in Los Olivos ended one man. It did not end the conditions that made him. This is what Netflix did not show you. Not because the writers and directors and producers were stupid or malicious. Many of them were talented, well-intentioned people making a quality television drama. But because the story that Netflix did not show is a harder story. It is a story that implicates American institutions. It is a story that requires sitting with the discomfort of understanding that our heroes and our villains are not always who we think they are. It is a story that asks you not just to watch the spectacle, but to reckon with the structure, the political, economic, and historical structure that produces Pablo Escobar's, and has not, in 3 decades since his death, stopped producing them. Pablo Escobar was born on December 1st, 1949. In Rio Negro, Colombia. He died on December 2nd, 1993. On a rooftop in Medellin, Colombia, 44 years. One day, in those 44 years, he transformed the world's cocaine supply chain from a scattered cottage industry into an industrial empire. He made himself one of the wealthiest men on earth. He corrupted a democracy. He bombed a passenger plane. He assassinated presidential candidates and ministers of justice and hundreds of police officers. He built housing for the poor and soccer fields for children and schools in the barrios and hospitals where there had been none. He built a prison for himself and called it justice, and the government accepted it. He escaped from that prison and hid in a city that protected him, even as it was being destroyed by his choices. He called his son on a phone that he knew was being monitored, because he could not stop loving his family, even when everything else had been stripped away. He died the day after his birthday, barefoot on a rooftop with one bodyguard, with his empire long since collapsed around him, with his family in exile, with the 2 most powerful law enforcement agencies in the Western Hemisphere closing in. And the question that remains, the question of what actually happened in those final seconds, whose bullet killed him, is one that Colombia and history have not answered, perhaps will not answer. What we know is that he is gone. What we know is that what he built is gone. What we know is that what he built it on, the poverty, the inequality, the abandoned communities, the corruptible institutions, the geopolitical calculations that made cocaine a useful tool rather than a crisis to be addressed. Much of that remains. The hippos still swim in the Colombian rivers. The questions still echo on the rooftop. And somewhere in the jungle, or under a field, or inside the wall of a house in Medellin that looks like any other house, the money waits. We have come to the end of the story, or rather, we have come to the end of the part of the story that has an ending. Pablo Escobar is not a story about a monster. He is a story about what happens when the world creates conditions in which monstrosity becomes not just possible but profitable, beloved, and politically powerful. He is a story about what institutions do when they are compromised, how they adapt, how they negotiate, how they tell themselves that this particular accommodation is necessary, and that some other line further down the road is the real one they will hold. He is a story about what happens when one nation's geopolitical priorities, the American decision to fight communism at all costs, including the cost of ignoring a cocaine trade that was devastating, American cities intersects with another nation's structural poverty in ways that create a catastrophe neither nation has ever fully accounted for. He is a story about what television does with real history, how it takes the complex and makes it consumable, how it takes the uncomfortable and makes it entertaining, how it serves up the spectacle while quietly editing out the parts that would disturb the audience too much. And he is a story about a boy born on a farm outside Medellin in 1949, who looked at the world and decided it owed him something, and spent 44 years collecting the debt. The only question worth sitting with, After all the facts, all the numbers, all the violence, all the money, all the corruption, all the love, is this one. What do we do with a world that keeps making the same conditions? That creates the same abandoned poor, the same corruptible institutions, the same geopolitical calculations, the same vacuum that the next Pablo Escobar will step into? Because he will come, he has already come, in various forms. In various countries, he will come again. The rooftop in Los Olivos did not answer that question. Neither did Netflix. You know the story now. The full story, the one they hid, what you do with it, that part is yours. We prefer a grave in Colombia to a prison in the United States. Los Extraditables, the front organization Pablo Escobar created for himself. He was a megalomaniac. Not only that, he was rich. He believed in power and that he could change the world through his power. D. Agent Javier Pina. Speaking about Pablo Escobar, my father was a person who didn't understand that you can love your family and still destroy the families of others. Sebastian Marroquin, son of Pablo Escobar. If you made it to the end, you know what to do. Subscribe, like, share this with someone who thinks they already know the Narcos story. Drop your city and time in the comments. I'll see you next time with another story they didn't want you to hear. Sleep well. And remember, the most dangerous stories are always the ones someone decided you shouldn't hear.